Hey there guys! So I know it's been quite a while since I've done a video where I talk, and I really wanted to get back into the swing of things. I've been wanting to tackle some more goth topics, and well, I thought a good starter up would be talking about a few of my personal pet peeves when it comes to goth. Now I know I shouldn't have to say this, but I feel it needs to be said anyway. These are strictly my own thoughts, so just keep that in mind if you decide to watch this video. That all being said, here are some of my personal pet peeves when it comes to goth. So my first pet peeve I have when it comes to goth is the people that say that they have been goth since they were around the ages of 5 to 13, or just generally young adolescent ages. Honestly, when I hear people say this, I can't help but wince at it. Unless you were listening to goth music at a very young age, and I mean real goth music, not bands like Evanescence, Marilyn Manson, Nine Inch Nails, Rammstein, or any other metal or industrial type music. I find this pretty unlikely. Now keep in mind, I'm not saying that it's impossible for a young person to have listened to actual goth music as a child, as they could have been exposed to it by a parent, family member, or a family friend who may have been into goth music and played it around them. But I've come to find that most of the time, this isn't the case. What I think people mean to say is that they have always been darkly inclined or had gothic inclination at a young age, which is much more likely to happen because while goth music is very niche and hidden, gothic inclined things like literature, films, and imagery, or dark macabre looking objects is something that is seen more in day-to-day life. So really, when I hear people say things like I've been goth since I was 8 years old, and then follow it up by explaining their fondness for gothic or darkly inclined things, but not actual goth music, I just want to pat them on the shoulder and say that it's okay if they didn't know what goth music was at a young age, because the truth of the matter is that most of us didn't know at that age neither, and it's totally fine. So personally, I would suggest that unless you listen to actual goth music as a child, you should instead say that you've always been gothic or darkly inclined, as that would be a more accurate thing to say to get your point across of your fondness for dark and macabre things at a young age. My second goth pet peeve is people who say things like goth is a mindset. Goth was never a mindset. Other than it being a name used by the old Germanic tribe from the Ottoman Empire, the word was never used again until the late 70s, when the goth music genre got its start. Goth was only used to describe the music genre as well as the fans of said music genre. After doing some digging into where this phrase came from, it seemed to have come about during the 1990s, when goth was starting to get misappropriated in the mainstream, when the actual goth music scene went back to the underground, after the attention it got in the 80s. Industrial music was starting to get popular around this time, where bands like Nine Inch Nails, Marilyn Manson, Orgy, Stabbing Westward, Filter, and Rob Zombie hit the mainstream with the industrial sound. Because of this and the lack of actual goth bands in the mainstream around this time, it made it seem like industrial music was the new goth, when that wasn't accurate at all, and sayings like goth is a mindset were starting to be passed around, and well, the damage was done. That being said, while there is no goth mindset as far as I'm concerned, I do believe there is a darkly inclined mindset, and that this particular mindset is what draws people to gothic or darkly inclined things. So if anything, I'm pretty sure this is what people mean when they say things like that. My next goth pet peeve is the people that say that goth has evolved. While this isn't necessarily wrong, as the music has changed a little bit in the last 20 plus years, I find that the people who say this try to use it as a justification for calling non-goth genres like industrial music, gothic metal, symphonic metal, visual kei, or darker indie type music goth. And I'm sorry, but that is just false. The real change that goth music had was just a slight modernization in the sound production, as well as the further progression of goth subgenres like death rock, dark wave, cold wave, and ethereal wave. I mean, if you listen and compare an 80s goth band like Baja's or Theater of Hate, and compared it to a post-80s goth band like Paralyzed Age or She Passed Away, you can hear that the sound is a tad different but still retains the primary sound structure and traits that define goth music.
The golden years, she's in parties. It's in the can. She's in parties. It's in the can. Oh, pushed against the wall. Never are we wrong. You can hold my hand down inside.
So yeah, it is true that goth music has evolved a little bit, but only in terms of slightly modernizing the 80s foundation and the further progression of goth subgenres. This is not a validation of genres like gothic metal, symphonic metal, industrial, etc. as goth, because that just isn't accurate when talking about post-80s goth music. The next pet peeve on my list is the people that think that just because they wear a pentagram or a pentacle or practice religions like Wicca, paganism, or Satanism, it makes them a goth. I tend to see younger people do this, but the fact still remains that these things don't make you a goth. Goth is not, nor has it ever been about religion, so just because you're into these things, it doesn't make you a goth. I'm sorry. My next pet peeve is people who say that goth isn't about the music because Susie from Susie and the Banshees and Robert Smith from The Cure say that they're not goth. Here's the thing. It's true that Susie and the Banshees and The Cure didn't play just goth music during their whole music career. The truth of the matter is that Susie and the Banshees only released one goth rock album, while the rest of their work, excluding their first 3 post-punk albums, were alternative rock. The Cure only released 7 goth rock albums, while the rest of their work was also alternative rock. I believe the reason why Robert Smith and Susie Sue were so adamant of getting away from the goth genre was because they were tired of all their newer post-80s work getting labeled as goth, because in actuality, they did eventually experiment with other genres of music during their career. But the fact still remains that their goth rock albums were very influential in laying down the sound structure of the goth rock genre, and helped aid in the inspiration for a lot of the goth bands that came out after the 80s. So saying things like goth isn't about the music just because Robert Smith and Susie Sue don't like being referred to as goth today is silly, because this doesn't erase their legacy and impact in the origins of goth sound with their first few albums that paved the way for other goth bands, even though they themselves eventually moved on to other genres of music. The next pet peeve I have is people who call 80s bands like Depeche Mode, New Order, Soft Cell, Tears for Fears, Adamant, and The Smiths goth bands. These bands were not goth. They were mostly new wave and synth pop, and while it's true that a lot of goths enjoy their work, it doesn't make their music goth. My next pet peeve is people who use the term gothy to describe things. Unless the object the person is referring to has goth music memorabilia on it, be it the band's symbol or image plastered all over it, they're using the wrong term for it. Like, I've seen people call things like articles of clothing or objects as gothy, and I just can't help but shudder when hearing that. I think what people mean to say when describing these things are terms like dark, macabre, or to a lesser extent, gothic, depending on what you're describing. Like, for example, clothing or objects that have pictures of well-known gothic literature icons, gothic artwork, or clothing that has a macabre feel to it. But if you're just describing something like a simple black object or simple garment of clothing, the proper terms that you're looking for is dark, macabre, or gothic, not gothy, which is not a real word, nor does it properly describe the thing that you're most likely talking about. The next pet peeve on my list is the people who say that the 19th century Victorian era was a goth era. This is one that always makes me laugh when I hear it, because it's just that ridiculous. The main reason why people seem to believe this is because of seeing photos of people wearing their funeral mourning garb, or seeing photos of the everyday Victorian man or woman wearing black or dark colors. You have to understand that goth was not a thing back then. This is just the way things were. People were very respectful of the deceased, and would wear black to funerals because all black meant back then was mourning and grieving. The clothing itself was just Victorian fashion in black. It really didn't mean anything other than showing respect for the dead, because the rules were quite rigid and strict when it came to funeral etiquette during that time period. Another fun fact about the Victorian era was that black was the color worn by the working class. So the reason why you see so many photos of people wearing black was because most people were working class individuals, and that was a standard uniform color. That, plus a lot of the working class were quite poor, and they didn't have many clothes to wear, so they would often only wear their work clothing because that was all that they could afford. So no, the Victorian era of the 19th century was not a goth era. It was just the way things were at the time, not a subculture. My last pet peeve I have is the people who cry elitist when someone says in order to be goth, you have to listen to or have enjoyment for goth music. I've said it before, but it bears repeating. There's a difference between someone being a true elitist and someone who's just being honest, and in most cases, it's the latter. But what really tends to piss me off when it comes to this is when someone asks another person who their favorite goth bands are, and they answer with, "Oh, I have so many favorite goth bands and genres of music," or "I don't listen to just goth music, I listen to all kinds of music." And I'm just sat there going, yeah, okay, but I'm asking about the goth bands you like. I'm not implying that you can't listen to other kinds of music, but I'm asking a specific question, so there's no need to bring up other genres. Honestly, I find people who say things like this are trying to say that they don't listen to goth music, because if they did, they wouldn't have to deflect the question, because the question is pretty straightforward. Now, I've heard from some people, who are usually younger, that they are too scared to share their favorite goth bands, for fear that they may get criticized for the bands they like, especially if they're not goth bands from the 80s. And to that, I say that so long as the bands you list are actual goth bands, you're gonna be just fine. Unless the person is an 80s elitist, I guarantee that if you share actual post-80s goth bands like, say, Rosetta Stone, Noferatu, Drab Majesty, She Passed Away, Angels of Liberty, Paralyzed Age, Switchblade Symphony, or London After Midnight, to name a few examples, you're gonna be just fine. However, if you say bands like Evanescence, Marilyn Manson, Nine Inch Nails, Motionless in White, Malice Misery, Slipknot, Nightwish, Within Temptation, Cradle of Filth, or Him for example, then yeah, it won't be surprising if you get the side eye, because these bands are not goth bands, and that doesn't make the person elitist for pointing that out. From there on, if the person is decent, they'll offer you some goth bands to check out. That is what I usually do after I ask what kind of sound they typically like and go from there. All I'm really saying is to actually listen to what the person is saying before you cry elitist, because most of the time, the person isn't being an elitist at all. And well, those were some of my personal pet peeves when it comes to goth. I'm pretty sure there are others that I may have left out, but these were the first few that came to mind. If you made it to the end, thank you. And I'll be doing more videos where I talk more about these kinds of things, so stay tuned for that if you're interested. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to leave a like, comment, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos coming soon. I'm Kai Decadence, and I hope you all have a great day. Thanks for watching.
Just press on.